Greetings and welcome. Today we're returning to our consideration and treatment of one of the most horrific events of the 20th century, the Holocaust, the final solution, the deliberate effort by the Nazi regime to exterminate all of Europe's Jews. Adolf Hitler, just to give you a little bit of background on the Holocaust, which I think you probably know something about already, but Adolf Hitler, as a former Austrian soldier in the 1920s, as a disgruntled and right-wing ideologue, wrote a book called Mein Kampf, and in 1925, he was very explicit about what his intentions were if he were to come to power. He was very explicit in particular about his intention and desire to exterminate the Jews of Europe and indeed the Jews of the world in this book, Mein Kampf. After he rose to power in Germany, which is a horrific and terrible saga, which I think everyone needs to learn about because of its possible implications for the 21st century as well. After he rose to power in Germany, the state enacted anti-Jewish legislation, all of which aimed at removing Jews from German society. What is interesting to know, though, is that the Jewish population of Germany was tiny. Less than 1% of the population of Germany was Jewish. The Jews of Europe lived in other countries further to the east, including Poland and Ukraine and other countries that we've read about in the writings of Timothy Snyder. After the beginning of World War II, anti-Jewish policy in Germany evolved into a concentrated and comprehensive plan to eventually annihilate the European Jewry. In its entirety, the final solution consisted of gassings, shootings, random acts of terror, disease, and starvation that accounted for the deaths of about 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the total population of Europe's Jews. By the way, I'm quoting from the History Museum of the Holocaust, which I'll cite in just a minute. We can go into a little bit of detail here about the concentration camps, the ghettos which were established. The Nazis first had the idea of concentrating the Jews of Europe into a small handful of concentrated areas of population in Poland and other Eastern European places. And then with the idea that those human beings would be transferred to other places for killing. But during the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, mobile killing squads, Einsatzgruppen, in 1941 to 1943, began killing entire Jewish communities. And the methods used, mainly shootings and gas vans, were soon regarded as inefficient and as a psychological burden on the killers. More organized killing centers began operations as early as 1941. The Chelmo killing center was one of the first of these. And the Nazis later established 5 other such camps: Belzec, Sobolar, Treblinka, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Majdanek. Victims at Chelmo were killed in gas vans. The Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka camps used carbon monoxide gases generated by stationary engines. And Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the killing centers, had 4 large gas chambers using Zyklon B as a killing agent. The gas chambers at Majdanek were used both carbon monoxide and Zyklon B. Millions of Jews were killed in the gas chambers in the killing centers as part of the final solution. All of this is quoting from and relying on the Museum of the Holocaust with the URL, which is provided here. The Wansi Conference is an important turning point. The Wansi Conference was a meeting involving the SS and the German government agencies in Berlin, where plans were discussed and developed and coordinated to implement the, quote, final solution, which was already underway, but in a fairly disorganized way. At Wansi, the SS estimated that the final solution would involve as many as 11 million European Jews, including those from non-occupied countries such as Ireland, Sweden, Turkey, and Great Britain. Between the fall of 1941 and 1944, the German railways transported millions of people to their deaths in killing centers in occupied Poland. After the war crimes trials were convened by the Allies, which were referred to as the Nuremberg trials because they took place in Nuremberg. These were a series of military tribunals convened after 1945 under the authority of international law and the laws of war. The trials involved the prosecution of leaders and commanders of military, economic, and judicial organizations in Nazi Germany who were accused of participation in the mass killing of Jews and other minorities, including the Roma, during the Holocaust. These trials led to eventual establishment of the International Criminal Court, and familiar figures, there were many, many people who were accused and tried, but familiar names will include Martin Bormann, Nazi Party secretary, Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and head of the Gestapo, Gustav Krupp, an industrialist, manufacturing giant accused of using slave labor in the Krupp factories, and Hans Frank, the Governor General of the occupation government in Poland, who oversaw the extermination of the Jews of Warsaw and the rest of Poland. All of these accused were convicted and sentenced to death, except Krupp, who was not in the end tried because of illness. So let's turn now to the observer, Hannah Arendt, the author of the book that you read, Eichmann in Jerusalem. Hannah Arendt is a woman of my discipline. She is a philosopher. She was born in 1906 and born in Germany, lived out her life, the better part of her adult life in the United States, and died in 1975. Arendt was a brilliant Jewish woman born in Germany. She became one of the most noteworthy political philosophers of the 20th century. She studied philosophy at Marburg University in Germany with Martin Heidegger, then obscure but famous German philosopher, obscure in the sense that his writings were obscure, and later a notorious Nazi Party member and university director. She then studied with Edmund Husserl and Karl Jaspers, both leading existentialist and phenomenologist philosophers. She wrote a doctoral dissertation under Jaspers. She fled Germany in 1933 at the time of the rise of Hitler's seizure of power, and the ascendancy of the Nazi Party at the age of 27. She fled to Paris, where she lived for 8 years through 1941. She then moved to New York, and was able to relocate with relatively little difficulty. She lectured and taught at a number of great universities, but was permanently affiliated with the New School for Social Research. The New School was established in New York City as a refuge for many expatriate European intellectuals. It was a real center for the intellectuals of Europe who had been expelled or intimidated and threatened and coerced to leave Europe. Particularly important books of hers were published in political philosophy, including The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, The Human Condition in 1958, when she was 52 years old, and Eichmann in Jerusalem, the book that we've read, which was published as a book in 1963. As a philosopher, Arendt was an innovative philosopher. She was an important philosopher. She tried to understand the situation of human beings in the world of the evils of the 20th century. She wanted to understand the 20th century. She was also noted for having a fundamentally independent mind. She was a little bit like Socrates in that way. She did not accept any dogma. She was neither on the left nor on the right. One of her more famous aphorisms, you could attribute this also to Socrates: there are no dangerous thoughts, it is thinking that is dangerous. she attempted to understand the totalitarianisms of both the right and the left, the Nazi dictatorship of Germany and the Stalinist communist dictatorship of the Soviet Union. Quoting from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a description of her theory of politics, which I think you will find relevant to other discussions we've had in this course, her conception of politics is based instead on the idea of active citizenship, that is, on the value and importance of civic engagement and collective deliberation about all matters affecting the political community. This should be kind of familiar to you because it is the ideology, it is the philosophy of the polis, which we talked about when we talked about Socrates. What led to the publication or the development of the book Eichmann in Jerusalem was the announcement, the stunning announcement, the internationally shocking announcement that Adolf Eichmann, notorious administrator and Nazi functionary, had been arrested, well, actually not arrested, but detained and kidnapped by Israeli Secret Service in Argentina and had been returned to Jerusalem for trial. As soon as Arendt heard about this amazing story, she proposed to the New Yorker magazine that she would like to write a detailed report on the trial, which was commissioned, and she then spent several months in Jerusalem attending and reporting on the trial and reading the voluminous court documents. It took a scholar to be able to do a full report on this trial because the documents were very extensive. So Eichmann was not charged during the Nuremberg prosecutions in 1945. That's for a couple of different reasons, but probably most important is that he had been detained by the US Army in Germany at the end of the war, but he had escaped from detention. On a work detail, he simply walked away. He then lived anonymously in Germany for another 5 years. He lived in Germany through 1950. He emigrated to Argentina in 1950 using false papers supplied by a Nazi sympathizer and Austrian cleric, a Catholic priest named Alois Hudal. Evidence about the scope of his culpability in directing aspects of the mass murder of Jews in the Holocaust was produced during the Nuremberg trials, 1945, and there then became a wider knowledge that Eichmann was an important functionary in the creation and administration and design of the processes of the Holocaust. He was located in Argentina by the very famous Nazi hunter, Simon Wiesenthal, in the 1950s, and he was then observed and covertly kidnapped by Mossad Israeli agents in Buenos Aires in 1960, and he was brought back to Israel covertly for trial on charges of crimes against humanity and crimes against the Jewish people. The decision to kidnap Eichmann was taken by the very top leadership of the country of Israel, by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who is legendary in Israel. And the decision to kidnap rather than to extradite was prompted by the fact that the Argentine government had been very sympathetic to the fugitive Nazi officials who had wound up in Argentina. They had steadfastly refused to extradite these fugitive Nazis on charges of the most horrendous war crimes and acts of genocide. And so the decision was made in Israel not to apply for extradition, but rather to covertly kidnap and smuggle him back to Israel. According to the Wikipedia article on Eichmann, which I found very interesting, the US CIA and the West German intelligence services, BND, had been aware of Eichmann's location for 2 years prior to his seizure, but they had not taken any action because they did not want to jeopardize other Nazi-era agents that they were currently controlling. And this is a subtext of post-war US scientific and political establishment, as well as Western European establishment, that there were many Nazi sympathizers, Nazi actors who wound up in rather good circumstances in the United States and Great Britain and France and other countries because of their scientific expertise or possibly their intelligence value, without regard to their Nazi past. So what did Eichmann bring to the Holocaust? It's a kind of a paradoxical thing, but Eichmann made a reputation and became valuable to the Nazi bureaucracy on the basis of the fact that he had acquired a knowledge of Zionism, the idea that there should be a homeland for the Jews, eventually the homeland of Palestine. And he had studied Zionism and had made relationships, formed relationships with various groups of Jewish leaders. He then became, for the Nazi government, the Jewish affairs expert. And once mass killings and deportations began, he became a logistics manager at a very high level, making plans for the movement of millions of Jewish prisoners to killing camps like Auschwitz in Poland and other countries. He asserted that he was simply a functionary following orders and had no moral involvement in what was being done to the Jews whom he had transported. Eichmann, in the trial which is described in the readings that you've done for today and for next week, Eichmann was convicted in December 1961 on 15 counts of crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, and other war crimes. He was sentenced to death by hanging. And the trial is generally considered not to be a kangaroo trial, not to be a show trial, but to have been conducted in a reasonable and procedurally exact way, thanks to the rectitude of the three distinguished tribunals. It is also interesting to me that several distinguished people of letters and philosophy, Pearl Buck and Martin Buber among them, after his sentence argued publicly against applying the death penalty to Eichmann, and they argued for a commutation of his death sentence by the president of Israel. That appeal by Eichmann was declined. It's interesting in reading these materials, as you have also read Timothy Snyder's completely powerful account of the events of the Bloodlands between 1933 and 1945, there are points of connection which allow us to kind of go back and forth between the narrative of Eichmann in Jerusalem and the charges against Eichmann and what we learn from the historical narrative in Timothy Snyder. Snyder's central point is that the majority of the killing in the Holocaust occurred outside of Germany, to the east, the Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, the Baltic states, and that it was both vicious, determined, intentional, and extensive. And Eichmann plays an important role in that because he provided part of the kind of problem solving and organizational capacity which allowed for systematic, widespread killing of eventually millions of men, women, and children. Snyder describes the strategy of killing the Jewish population where they lived rather than in concentration camps. Shootings, gas execution trucks, even burning people in buildings, just the most horrific scenes of murder and horrifying murder. He also emphasizes in his book, Bloodlands, that the mass killings that occurred were not restricted to the Nazi regime. In this same region, the Bloodlands, Stalin's Soviet Union policies waged war on the Ukrainian peasants through a program of deliberate starvation. And he makes the point that both Nazis and Soviets used deliberate starvation as a weapon of mass destruction. The Nazis starved its prisoners of war, the Soviet army prisoners of war, whom it captured in vast numbers, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, died of starvation. And they used these techniques or tools of starvation against Jewish populations as well. But we can see traces of these same kind of activities of the German military and the German state in Eastern Europe through the trial of Eichmann as well. Because the trial of Eichmann does make reference to the mass killings in the East. And it shows evidence, provides evidence that Eichmann had knowledge and perhaps even some command responsibility for the Einsatzgruppen, or the killing teams, that were active in the East. But these are exactly the police and military units which are described by Christopher Browning in the excerpts that you've read from Ordinary Men. So another connection between the 1963 book from Arendt and the more recent scholarship on the Holocaust, which you've also read. Arendt's book turned out to be a highly controversial book for a variety of reasons, some more justified than others. Beginning with a stylistic point, as you read the book, you may have noticed a kind of a lightness of tone and an irreverence of style that Arendt adopts. And this really is very resonant of the style of the New Yorker magazine in which the book, the original writing was published. I, anyway, see a lot of similarity between the style of the book and the style of the New Yorker even today. But this stylistic similarity is also compounded by Arendt's own intellectual irreverence. She doesn't hesitate, just like Socrates really, doesn't hesitate to express her own impressions without concern for whether they might be offensive to other people, in this case, to the Jewish community, though she is, of course, herself Jewish. Her specific comments about the various groups of Jewish leaders and elders who worked with Eichmann and the Nazi authorities implementing the final solution were especially criticized because she portrays these elders as having helped to lead the Jews to slaughter. And what Jewish leaders, especially Jewish leaders in the United States, believed was that these very same leaders that she's describing, with a few exceptions, there were traitors to the Jewish people who collaborated with the Nazis. But there was a much larger group of people who felt they could compromise with the Nazis. Arendt is very critical of those leaders, whereas American Jewish leaders were more inclined to be sympathetic to their good intentions. But most controversial is the way that Arendt, most controversial and in some ways most, the biggest takeaway from the book are the observations which Arendt makes about Eichmann as a person and as an actor in this drama. She was very surprised by what she saw in this man, in this Eichmann in the dock. She saw very quickly this is not a towering genius of evil. Rather, he was an ordinary, fairly stupid, in her opinion, low-achieving man of few talents. He failed at almost everything he did before his Nazi career. And this is a big piece of what she means by the banality of evil. That Eichmann, like many other participants in the German bureaucracy of death, was simply a fairly ordinary, if at times arrogant, human being. His distinguishing feature was that he was not at all self-reflectful or thoughtful. Arendt is contemptuous towards Eichmann. She does not consider him capable of great evil. This is the heart of the meaning of her phrase, the banality of evil, the everydayness of evil. Here's a quote that I think really captures her view from roughly page 278, though I have a slightly different edition than you do. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together. For it implied, as it has been said at Nuremberg over and over again by the defendants and their counsels, that this new type of criminal, who is in actual fact hostis generis humani, commits his crime under circumstances that make it well nigh impossible for him to know or to feel that he is doing wrong, committing a crime without recognizing that what he is doing is fundamentally wrong. That's banal evil. She then continues to say, of course, it is important to the political and social sciences that the essence of totalitarian government, and remember, she is an expert on totalitarian government, The essence of totalitarian government, perhaps the nature of every bureaucracy, is to make functionaries mere cogs of the administrative machinery out of men, and thus to dehumanize them. So really quite crucial to her interpretation is that Eichmann was merely a cog in the Nazi bureaucracy, and that the evil of Nazi performance wasn't embodied in Eichmann. It was embodied in this larger machine of deliberate, horrifying murder of millions of children, infants, women, and men. Men in their 20s, men in their teens, men in their 90s, everyone, without regard to any of their human qualities. That's the kind of evil. And yet she doesn't see that evil in Eichmann. She sees it in the administrative bureaucracy. But in the next 20 years, really deep doubts about this interpretation emerged. This most important theory that Arendt arrived at, the banality of evil. Later historians, including Christopher Browning, the author of Ordinary Men, whom we have now read a little bit of, these later historians have argued that Arendt fundamentally misunderstood Eichmann. He was not the unthinking bureaucratic functionary that Arendt believed him to be, but rather an ideologically motivated anti-Semite and lifelong committed Nazi who intentionally built a persona as a faceless bureaucrat for presentation at the trial. This is quoting from a book from the, 2000 something, by Bettina Stangneth, Eichmann Before Jerusalem, which was intended to debunk the interpretation of Eichmann, which had been put forward by Arendt and had been accepted by many, many people. And furthermore, it is noted that even Eichmann's son, Ricardo, who is now a professor, was a professor until his retirement in Germany. Ricardo seemed to agree with the idea that his father, that Adolf Eichmann, was an ideologically motivated anti-Semite and a lifelong committed Nazi who deceived Arendt as an observer and attempted to deceive the court and deceive the process of justice. Stangneth, in her book, is now generally thought to have refuted Arendt's reading of the man based on some very extensive transcripts of interviews from Buenos Aires in 1956, which were performed by a Dutch Nazi journalist expatriate, Willem Sassen. And these transcripts became public in the 1990s, but they were available to the prosecutors, or at least big segments of them were available to the prosecutors in Eichmann's trial. And Eichmann was very explicit in his interviews with Sassen, explicit about his anti-Semitism, his hatred of the Jews, his delight in having participated in the murders of millions of Jewish people. It's very hard, according to Stangneth and according to these other observers, hard to read these transcripts without understanding this was a committed, ideologically extreme advocate of the final solution. Here is Christopher Browning in his summary assessment in a book, again, which I hadn't known about before preparing this lecture, but I found it completely fascinating. A book on the use of the testimonies of people who've committed horrible acts. So here's quoting Christopher Browning. For the record, let me state that I consider Arendt's concept of the banality of evil a very important insight for understanding many of the perpetrators of the Holocaust, but not Eichmann. Arendt was fooled by Eichmann's strategy of self-representation in part because there were so many perpetrators of the kind he was pretending to be. This is an interesting view taken by Browning, that Eichmann really was a devoted, committed, and intentional Nazi who was pretending to be the colorless bureaucrat cog in the machine. And in fact, Browning believes that Eichmann told three big lies, great lies, he calls them, in his testimony at his trial and in other places where he tried to represent his own point of view. Here are the three lies. First, Eichmann claimed that he was not an anti-Semite. Personally, I have no hatred against the Jews, he said. That's not true. That's demonstrated by the Sasson interviews. Second, Eichmann portrayed himself in his early career from the 1930s through 41 as an idealist and indeed a veritable Zionist. He was possessed by the idea of helping the Jews through finding a territory for them. Again, a great lie in Browning's reading of all of the available evidence. His third great lie was that from that point on, he was an utterly passive receiver of orders who took no initiatives and made no decisions. He simply obeyed. He had nothing to do with the killing of Jews, though admittedly he played a minor role in their evacuation. Browning believes this too is a lie. Eichmann was deeply involved in the organization and the management of the concentration of the Jews, the export of the Jews, the evacuation of the Jews, and the murder of the Jews. And he was directly and personally involved and exposed to the killing camps, including Auschwitz. I would note for us in this course that Browning's work as an historian here, trying to piece together how can we make sense of the evidence of Eichmann's statements in the interviews he did with Sasson, for example. How can we make sense of these statements knowing that Eichmann lies and Eichmann is interested in presenting himself in the most innocent possible way? His analysis is very similar to the description which Mark Bloch gives of critical historical methods. It's just a very interesting parallel, in my opinion. So, what about the book, Eichmann in Jerusalem? What about Hannah Arendt's interpretation? Now that I've read these criticisms and read what underlies them, I guess I've come to the conclusion that they're right, that Arendt was fooled, she was deceived, she was manipulated as an observer of this man, and fundamentally, she did not understand Eichmann. She was deceived. This was, in fact, a committed, active, and engaged Nazi leader, and that Browning's notion that the banality of evil applies to many individuals, including possibly the men in the killing groups that he describes in his own book, but it does not apply to Eichmann. Thanks.